Okay, we have two people here with the microphones. It's question time, and yes, please remember short questions, no monologues. Yeah, that would be wonderful. The young man over there. Meredith. Oh, okay. If that takes longer, Meredith, can you give it to the gentleman over there? Thank you.
My question is, why are we still using the term anti-Semitism, a term rooted in race science of the late 19th century, as opposed to a more direct term like Jew hatred?
Yes,
I think actually I've begun to argue that we should use Jew hatred, but it's not really rooted so much in the idea of race science. Wilhelm Marr, who popularized the term, he didn't create it, was looking for a better term, more all-encompassing term than Judenhass, Jew hatred, because he wanted to say that even a Jew who doesn't observe Judaism should be hated. So he used that term. It's become connected to it. I intersperse the term often with Jew hatred, but if you do use the term anti-Semitism, it should not be hyphenated, because it's not it's not being against Semitism, it's Jew hatred.
And I think now we can get the young gentleman over there. Yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for all your presentations. They were very enlightening. One thing that particularly struck me was Professor Lipstadt's comment about, paraphrasing here, bringing those kind of uncomfortable conversations to the table. And as a very early career historian who often finds his head kind of buried in the sand of the details and the nitty-gritty, and then tries to have these conversations with people outside of that world. I wonder, as has been made clear through your movie, you don't engage with Holocaust deniers outright. So how do you find the correct kind of balance of who can we find that's salvageable? Mm-hmm. And how do we determine what internet trolls and political figures we just brush aside and say it's hopeless? How do we kind of...
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to figure it out. But I think one of the things I do in my book is I talk about the fact that the extremist anti-Semite we all recognize, just like we recognize the extremist racist. But there are other kinds. There's the dinner party anti-Semite. The person who says, oh, we just hired a new young associate. He's an Orthodox Jew, but he's very honest. That kind of thing, which is very insidious. It's sort of, there's a writer for The Atlantic, Franklin Foer, who defines a philo-Semite as an anti-Semite who likes Jews. I like Jews because they work. We even have a president who said, I want, short guys with yarmulkes being my accountants. So it's that turning around. My not engaging with Holocaust deniers, and I think both my panelists, colleagues here would agree and totally, is because they're liars. You can't debate a liar. They're not an other side of the opinion. I wouldn't debate an anti-Semite, but I would show the stupidity of what they're saying, or the illogic or the hatred of what they're saying. So I would call them out, not to engage in a debate. There's no debating it. I'll give you one example, and sometimes these things come to us, I always say, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when we had the conversation at 7 o'clock the night before. But a friend of mine was graduating from nursing school. She was with a small group of women she had gone through nursing school with. They're all from the Midwest of the United States. None of them had really ever encountered Jews before. They had become very close with my friend's family who lived in New York. A very observant family, went to holidays, went to Friday night dinner, loved being part of it. Come fast forward to the luncheon they're having right before graduation, just the group of students, and one of them is talking about what she's going to miss in New York. She's going to miss in New York stores with real bargains. This is before you had bargain outlet malls and things like that. And she said, and she had just discovered this great store in the Bronx, which had things from Saks and from Lord & Taylor. People here will know I'm talking about Loehmann's. But before she began to describe the store and the great bargain, she turned to my friend, the only Jew at the table, and said, you're really going to be interested in this. And my friend is very quick, And she responded by saying, usually I would come up with a great response at 2 o'clock in the morning. She said, I didn't know Jews were the only ones to be smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money. So that was the kind of clueless anti-Semitism. So it's not a debate, but it's calling people out. You know, I don't know. Daniel, you're in the public eye, so what?
Yeah, well, I've had somebody once say to me at a party, I always say, never sue. It's the sort of thing that Jews do. So I said, that's funny. Some of my best friends are Jews, like my mother. That's why. My usual response to people who write to me anti-Semitic things is, thank you for your email warning me about the Jews. I'll certainly keep an eye out for them. They sound terrible.
Okay. Yes, I think the lady over there, please. Oh, there were two. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for enlightening all of us. I have a question that's been puzzling me, and I'm hoping you can further enlighten me. I see the 45th President of the United States as a highly prejudiced, anti-Semitic individual, and yet I see Bibi Netanyahu closely embracing him, and I have a very hard time conjoining those two. How do you see this, and what's happening here?
Daniel?
I think he's making grotesque political error, Bibi Netanyahu, because for the Israeli government to reside all of its faith in the Republican Party, and in particular to this leadership of the Republican Party, assumes that it will last forever. So just at the most basic level, it is a ridiculous political error. But it's also, I think, actually a moral error, personally, because I think I mentioned in passing saying that the right was too busy hating Muslims to have enough time to hate the Jews. And I said that was false comfort, and it really is. I think to believe that someone who holds these prejudices is not going to turn around on you eventually is a really, really naive thing to think. You know, like a lot of things that Bibi Netanyahu thinks, I just think he's making a big mistake in doing it. But people do that. I understand his transactional belief, but you know, anyone who's done a deal with Donald Trump will know that in the transactions, usually the other party doesn't do that well.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think, though, it's very important to recognize, and I agree with Daniel 100%, excuse me, that it's a mistake, and it's a mistake to do this kind of thing, that Bibi Netanyahu didn't find much support from Western democracies, liberal left Western democracies. And it's very important, you know, not to politically weaponize anti-Semitism. I have friends on the left who have 20/20 vision to seeing anti-Semitism on the right. And they're right, they're seeing correctly. And I have friends on the right who are 20/20 vision to seeing it on the left. They never see it next to them. So I think that that's...
Yeah, that's a reasonable point.
I think my question follows up a little bit the last one. How do you perceive the Jewish support to leaders that some of them are anti-Semitic, others are racist, or others just use a lot of this kind of conspiracy theories in Europe and South America, not to mention here?
I don't know what you mean by Jewish support.
For instance, I'll tell from where I come from. I'm from Brazil. There is a great support by many members of the Jewish community to Mr. Bolsonaro, who's perceived as a good friend of Israel and certainly of Netanyahu, while he's very homophobic and racist and so on. But Jews perceive that he represents a safe place for them and a great support for Israel. And I think the same thing could be said about certain groups in Italy and in Hungary and Poland and so on.
I think the same thing I just said a moment ago in my postscript to Daniel's comment. is that I think it's a mistake, but I think one has to also ask, why would they end up in the arms of someone who was so despicable? Where were they made? I mean, the same thing happened in Britain, in that many Jews who had no desire, and not saying the Conservative Party is despicable, absolutely not, but who had no desire to vote for the Conservatives, for the Tories, isn't that true? It just, you know, they...
Sense of political homelessness.
The sense of political homelessness, because the Labour Party made it very clear they weren't the least bit interested, or at least the leadership of the Labour Party. I'm sitting with two Brits here, I shouldn't be...
Yeah. I mean, just to add this, my mum always used to say about the people who were, you know, she spent quite a bit of time giving Holocaust education and spent quite a little bit of time with other survivors. And she used to say, you know, some of them are quite difficult or querulous or like anybody else, right? They're not saints like anybody else. And in exactly the same way, Jews are like anybody else. So some of them will be homophobic, right? And that just stands to reason, because a lot of people are. And so the interesting question would be, of a person of a given social class, and political background, does being Jewish make them more or less likely to vote for Bolsonaro, right? And I suspect it possibly makes it less likely, but without that kind of statistical knowledge, you can't say, will any Jew support somebody like that, because Jews have different political opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I give you mine. This is our journalist.
Thank you. I'm actually asking a question on behalf of a friend of mine who made Aliyah and happened to be in New Jersey shortly after the mass murders in Jersey City. And I knew this was coming. She said to me, "You're living in denial." And I wanted to ask the experts here, with your historical perspective, are Jews in the U.S. safe, or should we be packing our bags?
Absolutely not packing our bags. That's an extremist kind of view. It's alarmist. This is not 1938, not 1933, it's not 1938. I'll tell you a story that I once heard at the Holocaust Museum from a gentleman who had grown up in a smaller town in Germany. The school in that town, which he went to, what we would call the public school, became overtly Nazi. I mean, everybody in it, the teacher showed up in a uniform of some segment of the Nazi party. And the kid was having a terrible experience, so the parents sent him to a Jewish boarding school in a larger city. And on the night of Kristallnacht, the teachers came into the building, said, "The synagogue of this Jewish school is burning, get out, run out." And the kids ran out in their pajamas. And they got outside, and they said they didn't know where to run to. And channeling Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' mother, they said, "We're going to look for the helpers. We're going to go to the policeman." And they ran up to the policeman, and the policeman with a sneer said, "I don't help Jewish children." That's not today. There's nothing compared to today. So your friend who wants to maybe make you feel uncomfortable to justify his decision or whatever it is, I think it's short-sighted and it's silly.
Thank you for your amazing presentations. The topic is past and present and the impact of the past, but I was wondering, how do you see the tying together of anti-Semitism definition with anti-Zionism, which is something that many Jewish organizations are fighting for? The European accepted it, the Israeli representative are seeing something positive in it. But from time to time I wonder, and as a historian, how do you tie it together? What is the impact? What does it do to the whole concept of anti-Semitism, etc.?
Sure. The connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. You want to know?
You go first.
Okay. Look, what do you do about Satmar Hasidim, who are violently anti-Zionist? On the march last month in Brooklyn, across the Brooklyn Bridge. Some of you may have been there. As we went onto the bridge and as we came off, there were a group of Satmar Hasidim saying Zionism is the fault or whatever it is. So I think you have to be careful. However, having said that, so that it doesn't, not everybody who disagrees with there being a Jewish state is ipso facto an anti-Semite. Having said that, someone who says, well, we should just have there should just be a Palestinian state or a one state with an Arab majority or something. And I say, well, where should the Jews go? And they channel Helen Thomas and they say, back to Poland. Of course, 60%, over 60% of the Israeli population it would not be considered Caucasian, Israeli Jewish population. Are not Caucasian Jews. They're not from Poland. They're from Iran, they're from Iraq, they're from Egypt, they're from Yemen, they're from Morocco. So the glibness with which people are willing to say, oh, 6 million people should just go someplace else or something, makes me wonder. And also and here I have no question with tying the two together, in many of the critiques, not critiques of Israeli policy. Critiques of Israeli policy is not anti-Semitism. Many people, I would guess, are critical of American policy now. They're not anti-Americanism, just like many people who might love American policy now, 4 years ago, were criticizing it. So that's not. But when there's a myopic view of Israel as the only one wrong in this crisis, or the explaining of the problems using anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic explanations, then I have to wonder, where is that coming from? Or the one other thing, and with this I'll turn it over to my colleagues, lately I've been hearing, Israel was founded in sin, therefore it has no right to exist. So I asked the person who said this, who didn't know who he was talking to, poor him, but I wasn't going to reveal. What did he mean by that? And he said, because they chased the Arabs out. And I said, that's not entirely true. Many left because imams and Arabic-speaking radio stations from Egypt, from Jordan, from other places were saying, leave, and you'll come back in 10 days and you'll get the Jews' homes and their houses will defeat them, etc. But there were places where Jews fighting forces chased out Palestinians. We know that, chased out Arabs. That point, every Palestinian, Jews, Palestinian, Arabs was the nomenclature. So when I acknowledged that, he said, well, they were founded, there's a sin in it. Country can't exist like that. So I said, let's put that in a larger historical context. And let's think of other countries which have founding sins in their history. Let's start with Britain and colonialism. Let's start with the United States of America and our treatment of the Native Americans and slavery. And let's not comfort ourselves that we live in the North, therefore the North benefited quite a bit, and let's not comfort ourselves that my family came here after slavery was over because there was neo-slavery for at least 100 years. Or let's look at Canada and the treatment of the First Nation. Or let's look at Australia and the treatment of the Aborigines, or New Zealand and the Maoris. In other words, I'm not saying Myanmar and the Rohingya, or Syria and minorities there, or China. I'm saying other countries. And I'm not saying, I said to him, I'm not saying that makes it all right. They didn't. But no one is questioning the right of those countries to exist. So when you begin to take that myopic view, then I have to ask, where is that coming from? And that's where it comes to anti-Semitism.
So my grandfather was not actually a Zionist. He was one of the leaders of the German Jewish movement and integrationist, and one of the leaders of the community. And he actually wrote a book on Zionism called Travels in Palestine. He was an Arabist, and he wrote a book saying, we can't move there. It's like there are people living there already, and it's miles to the nearest deli. Who wants to go there, right? So, and the Zionists replied to him, if we don't go there, we're all going to die. Okay, and he would say, if we do go, the people who live there will resist us. And the great tragedy of the Jewish people is they were both correct. And Amos Oz has this thing where he says, when his father was a young man, he had the signs all over Europe, which Jews go to Palestine. And now the signs all over Europe say Jews get out of Palestine, right? And I think despite all of the problems of the creation of the State of Israel that my grandfather had seen, the need for its existence was established by the fact that his daughters ended up being in a concentration camp and his wife starved to death, and he ended up in exile, and the country was necessary. So my view is, at the same time as fighting anti-Semitism, and at the same time as being prepared to be completely critical of the Israeli government, anti-Zionism has to be fought too, because of the absolute necessity of the existence of the State of Israel to the Jewish people. And if people go as far as to argue that it should not exist, or to make arguments that amount to the same thing, which is, there should be a singular secular state, which is effectively to say it should not exist, and is a phony argument, because that's not what would take its place. That argument has to be resisted. And I also point out this, when someone throws a rock at a Jew, you don't pick it up and go, I wonder whether that was an anti-Semitic rock or an anti-Zionist one.
Yeah, I'm glad we are addressing all the elephants in the room. Who is...
There's one in the back.
Oh, there's so many. Okay. Who was first? I don't want to be unfair. Okay, Susan is... So who was ahead? Okay, the one who was ahead. Okay. I know. Good. Can you get to him?
Thank you very
Also
much.
here.
When I was growing up, my parents, who were Holocaust survivors, rightly or wrongly, used to say to me that when it came to the anti-Semitism that they experienced, the Germans were bad, but the Poles were worse. And recently, or relatively recently, the Polish government passed a law, I guess, saying that it was against the law to tie the Polish people and the government to any complicity in the Holocaust. And while this isn't strictly Holocaust denial, it seems to be a denial of facts related to the Holocaust. And I'm just wondering, Professor Lipstadt,
I
or
write
any of the
about
others.
this. I write about this in my book. What you're talking about is a law that the Polish government issued a little less than 2 years ago, saying correctly that one shouldn't talk about Polish concentration camps because they were, or Polish death camps, because they were not Polish death camps. They were death camps erected by the Germans in occupied Poland. Then the second element, which is what you're referring to, is that they said that they made it criminally illegal to talk about the collaboration of the Polish people, the Polish state, because there was no state, in the Holocaust. And that got a very strong reaction, including from the representative of the State of Israel, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, etc., saying that this is soft-core Holocaust denial. They went after people, Jan Gross, a person who used to teach here at Princeton. They went after Jan Grabowski, who teaches at the University of Iowa, both born and raised in Poland, for Jan Gross for his work on Jedwabnia, and Grabowski also for Polish participation, and other they went after Polin, the new Museum of Polish Jewish History, etc. About last summer, I would guess, no, I'm sorry, summer of 2018, they made a few adjustments in the law, and they changed it from being a criminal punishment to a civil punishment. And it was embraced by the government of Israel, the present government of Israel, and was severely criticized by historians left and right, myself included. I talk about it in the book. But going back to your first premise, the Poles were not worse than the Germans. The Holocaust was something created, designed, directed by the Germans. Many Jews from Poland interacted with Poles more than they did with Germans. But this was a German enterprise, assisted by Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, et cetera, et cetera. There were Poles who absolutely not collaborated. There were Poles who turned Jews in, who said there's a Jew hiding here, there's a Jew hiding there, or when the Jew, will we get their money, will we get something like that? And there were many wrongs done. but the notion that the Poles were worse than the Germans is.
Can I just add something to that? In the last fortnight, I've discovered something about my mother's story which relates to this. I'd always known that the reason that that her life was saved, that she was put in Belsen rather than sent to Auschwitz, and that from Belsen she actually was on one of the very rare exchanges, is because they possessed a Paraguayan passport. And my family has no relationship with Paraguay. No one never lived in Paraguay and has nothing to do with it. So I've always wondered where these passports come from. Well, our latest piece of research has discovered that a group of Poles in exile at the Polish embassy in Bern created thousands of these by buying them off the Paraguayan consul, filling them in and paying him off to sign them. And one of these documents we have, and saved my mother's life. It is true that all these stories of Poles that you tell are true, but there are also other stories of righteous Poles who did the right thing, and that deserves to be mentioned too.
But today, the Polish government is trying to rewrite the history, and there you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And they're trying to rewrite it. They're trying to decide who should be the next director of Polin, which has become a very big debate. A wonderful museum, but they want to control it. They tried to control the training at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the museum. They are intent on doing this. And sadly, they're not getting enough pushback, I think, as they should be getting.
It's an analogous situation in Hungary.
Yes,
today
you
as
would talk
well,
about
so,
that,
yeah,
right.
indeed.
Hungary rewriting of history. We Hungarians were the
And
victims.
the House of Terror Museum
Right.
that was opened, and
Right.
this memorial as well to the Hungarian victims of the war,
Right.
rather than.
And the attack on Soros,
Yes.
because he's for democracy. And I've even heard Jews say, well, he was a Nazi. Hello, he was 14 years old during the war. I mean, let's be a little realistic.
Okay, yes, could you give it to the gentleman down here? Yeah.
In the last few years, I've been reading a number of articles and studies about how the spread and the continuing just below the boil of prejudices of all kinds, including anti-Semitism, is largely the result of the ease with which disinformation and misinformation is continuously recirculated. And I've been reading studies that talk about how to inoculate people against this kind of disinformation through what is now called pre-bunking, as well as debunking. I was wondering if you could comment on how those kinds of strategies can combat not only anti-Semitism, but disinformation and deliberate misinformation of all kinds.
I'm not a specialist in I don't know, do you have a, but it's true. When I started to work on Holocaust denial, if you wanted Holocaust denial material, you got it in a plain brown envelope to a post office box. Now all you have to do is go to Mrs. Google and she'll tell you in 30 seconds, put in Anne Frank's diary, and in certain ways, the way you configure it, sometimes the third or fourth source is a denial source. So it's very much there. And it's all forms of prejudice and hatred. As I said, the moral guardrails are down there, but it's coming, maybe it's because we're about to end, right and left. Don't just look across the political a divide to the other side. It's coming from both sides. And if you only see it on one side, then what I would conclude is you're really not interested in fighting anti-Semitism, you're interested in scoring political points.
Yeah, scoring political points. So, yeah, no political points, I hope.
One thing that you haven't mentioned directly is the BDS movement, and I think that unless, I don't know, I mean, I think that's caused a lot of controversy in Jewish communities with the BDS resolution, and I just wondered if you could talk about that.
BDS is not about boycott, divest, or sanction. It's about toxifying Israel, making Israel toxic, making Israel negative, so that the kid who's going on a birthright trip won't announce it in the dorm, but just might sneak off quietly, kind of thing. You can't boycott. Yeah, everybody who boycotts Israel should please turn in their iPhones, should stop using Waze and 1,000 other things. I mean, it's ludicrous. But it's, again, an attempt, if you read the founding documents of BDS, They are for the destruction of the state of Israel. Right of complete return, 5 generations of Palestinians. In no other refugee movement do you get that kind of sweeping thing. And it calls for, as Daniel was saying, one secular state. Name for me one Muslim state, secular or otherwise, there is none that is secular really, in which a religious minority is thriving. Any religious minority. You know?
In Germany, BDS was declared anti-Semitic in the German parliament in May 2019.
Right.
So we have the BDS problem as well in Germany.
Right. I'm not sure that declaring it anti-Semitic by the Bundestag was tactically the smartest thing, but it is at its heart.
We're trying our
Yes,
best.
but
Yeah.
good intentions. But
Good intentions.
It was pushed by the Jewish community, right?
Okay. Do we have? Wait a second. I think we are coming to an end now because we have also a book signing. So if you want to buy Deborah Lipstadt's book or Julie Gottlieb's, we are going to set up a table here, and you can just come up to us, and we have more discussions. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you so much for our speakers. Thank you.